Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
With something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we began a conversation with three Seattle area faith leaders. They represent the Catholic, Episcopalian, and Lutheran traditions of Christianity. The focus of that discussion was the escalation of attacks on major ministries of their faiths. First, the sermon delivered after the presidential inauguration in January, and then their work on behalf of refugees, immigrants, and the poor. In part two of the Inconvenient Good news of the gospel, these leaders share their sense of the implication of such attacks. We are welcoming back this week our three panelists from last week, our three guests. So we can continue on that conversation. We have with us Sister Kathleen Pruitt, congregation leadership team of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. Mm-hmm. And you were also vice president of Pax Christi, a very well-known international organization. We'll maybe talk about that. We have Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton, the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Everett. And you were, I understand, the first ordained woman to serve as vice president of
let me see if I get it right, the House of Deputies of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and I was the first indigenous woman.
Indigenous woman, okay. Thank you very much, and given the length of that title, that's why I deferred to Rachel to elaborate on that. And surely what is a familiar face on this program, Reverend Terry Kyllo, a Lutheran pastor, and executive director of Paths to Understanding, which has been really doing a lot of important work in terms of interfaith dialogue, as well as within the Christian household. So, Terry, thank you so much for joining us as well. To varying degrees, as we look at surveys, polls taken over the last 3 months since the inauguration, we see that although the approval ratings have dropped for the current administration, there are significant numbers of each of our faith communities that we're representing here that show that they approve of what the Trump administration is doing in terms of immigration, in terms of their criticism of Bishop Buddy, who did the sermon after the inauguration. I'd ask each of you, and perhaps, Sister, we might start with you, how do you react to that?
With a mixture of sadness and anger. Mm-hmm. I think, a misunderstanding of the political structure. Politics is the art of governing a people, so that the people you govern can live fully, can live wholly, and enjoy the life. Mm-hmm. I think what we've done is essentially cut into categories the people we love. Mm-hmm. And so those who criticize the efforts that you're describing, the efforts to extend faith beyond mm-hmm. the pew, and who can see that politics that essentially denies people human rights, mm-hmm. that is, not only throw them out of the country, fails to recognize that essentially we are a nation of immigrants. Mm-hmm. My secret hope is that the indigenous communities of this country could stand up and say, all of you get out of here. Mm-hmm. This is our country, and you stole it from us. And I think that so it's failure, I think, to reflect upon what we want from our politicians, mm-hmm. and how politicians exercise their legitimate authority, mm-hmm. In making the decisions that essentially allow for the wholeness of all people. The movement of an immigrant out of this country says more about our misunderstanding of the Constitution mm-hmm. than it does an adherence to. So that I find myself conflicted. I'm usually peaceful. But basically, in this recent time, I find myself struggling personally mm-hmm. with the anger that says, you get out and leave the immigrants here. and just, take yourself and go find a hole. Because basically it is a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of the Constitution. It is a misinterpretation of what the role of a politician. It is a misunderstanding of the gospel upon which many of us rely as a guideline for human interaction and human life.
Rachel, you can speak with particular authority in terms of sisters' hopes for the Indigenous community.
Indigenous community. Well, there's two things I would say around the political concerns that people have, and certainly in the Episcopal Church and in my congregation, I had one instance of a couple basically writing and saying that they were going to go somewhere else because we kept talking about politics. Mm-hmm. And I went back through, there's nothing in the sermons that is signaling out a party or anything, or even a person. We've been talking about social justice issues and about the impact on real people in our pews. It's not a theoretical moment. Mm-hmm. There are immigrants in my pews. There are people of color. There are women. There are, on and on and on. And they're all trying to and are committed to being that diverse community together. So this pulls them together actually in a more way. But the thing is, two things. If people who are concerned that suddenly our churches are becoming political, I think perhaps they have not been given the opportunity to have a good understanding of the context of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And the political aspects to which he is absolutely responding, not only toward the Roman Empire, but also toward the conservatives of his own faith. Mm-hmm. So he is addressing two things simultaneously, but always inviting interrelationship, even while speaking the truth. That table ministry he has around fellowship, mm-hmm. inviting everybody's welcome to that table, and he's certainly going to have a real conversation with them, like you are. So the second thing I would say around the Indigenous is that I think there are a lot of Indigenous people right now, and frankly a lot of communities of color, that are sitting here in this moment kind of going, well, duh, this has been what we've been experiencing for generations.
Right, yeah.
Being marginalized, being treated as less than, being invisible. And for Indigenous people, that invisibility is real. There isn't a single one of the 700 plus agreements between the government and people that hasn't been broken. The treaties have all been broken mm-hmm. over the years. And the very first thing that the government did, and this is before this, this time, but when the Navajo were suffering with their first big COVID outbreak, mm-hmm. and these are folks who, for the most part, the elders are living on land to which there's not an infrastructure of electricity or running water, the first thing the government sent them for aid was a shipment of body bags. Now, white people, welcome to your shipment of body bags, because this government is not going to care about your well-being. Yeah.
So the response of many Christians in the country to support the current policies toward the poor, toward immigrants, toward people of diverse cultures and traditions is really disturbing. It's not new, as Rachel and the sister have said. Mm-hmm. Some of that are the echoes of the doctrines of discovery and the kind of domination system that a theology that got operationalized into a lot of policies. The other piece is that, according to research, about 30% of Americans are authoritarian leaning mm-hmm. or full authoritarians, and another set, lean pretty strongly that way. And so Christian nationalism is a movement that's been building for many, many years on these historical roots. And what they really want to do is to strengthen a hierarchy of importance, of one group over another, and then what they're saying right now is that they want the president to be on top. Mm-hmm. And to distribute wealth and to get a cut of everything and to distribute who gets respect, who gets the rule of law, and who gets oppressed by mm-hmm. the full force of the federal government. And many of these people, though, when you talk to them, what they would say to you when I sit across the table from what they say to me when I sit across the table is that they long for simpler times, that they feel the world is too complex. They are nostalgic about what has happened. And I think it's true that cultural diversity, when added to it, is social distance. That is, groups don't know each other. Mm-hmm. And we have become more and more isolated in the last 60 years. And so there's greater cultural diversity that people are aware of, and yet we don't know each other, and that leads to a kind of distrust. So there are contextual things that are happening to us, and there are also historical reasons why these Christians are saying this. And so what I want to say is that what many on the right want to do is do away with cultural diversity. Or they want to minimize them or make them second or third or fourth class citizens. What we want to do, what I think the values of Jesus call us to do, is to decrease social distance. That is, for us to get to know each other. And I think most Americans would rather get to know each other than do what some folk want to do in terms of giving up our constitutional democracy, as flawed as it has been. I think more Americans would want to strengthen our democracy by getting to know each other than by giving up all of our power to a new King George.
We have the domestic changes and the desire to boot out immigrants, refugees, and so forth. We also see a cutting off of foreign aid, and that has been termed as actually an important aspect of power, albeit soft power. Right now, overseeing that is Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who some have pointed out that's rather ironic since his family came as refugees from Cuba and were able to thrive and survive based on aid to refugees. So I guess, what's your reaction to this cutting off of aid to the poor, the needy in other countries?
I'm not sure how to tackle it, Jeff. I think that it not only is it mishandled, it is essentially cutting our own nose off to spite our face. It really is. I mean, the United States, as the wealthiest nation in the world, truly, cannot see beyond the border, that to do that is also to self-destruct in many ways, because that aid which goes to countries creates a sense of at least respect for, if not, not a political dimension of connection, but so you isolate yourself and make enemies instead of friends, and essentially leave those who otherwise will suffer death and devastation empty, as in no caring. I mean, who wants to deal with us? Who will want to deal with us? And so you build this little isolationist nation that cares nothing except for itself. And it's sort of like when they came for me, there was no one there. I think it is self-destructive. I think it is short-sighted. You mentioned Rubio. It is interesting how short a memory can be, that he is doing to people what could have been done to him in terms of saying, well, we're just not going to deal with you. Go back to your home. Go back. I find the cutting off of aid reprehensible. I do, reprehensible. And I think it speaks to the world of a total change in relationship to us as a nation. And my hope is that the principles that are being exercised, the tariffs, et cetera, that those countries will stand firm, and that we will feel the pinch of a government that is totally out of control.
Yeah, it seems to me like what's happening domestically in determining, the government is saying, as Terry said, who's in and who's out, who's going to be part of this empire and who's not, is happening on that global scale with what have been important partnerships and relationships since World War II and even before. And just watching that kind of play out is even more painful. And the church is, again, like the Episcopal Church is an international church, and so our aid and relationships have been very important to us. And some of those federal grants are coming to the church to help do those programs. And one of the examples is Bishop Michael Hunn, who is right there in a diocese that's right on the border, and he's working with people in the Diocese of Rio Grande who they have historically been helping migrants as they have appropriately entered the country, have legally come, are going through a long, protracted legal process, and using those funds to help them in between that time, making sure the legal process is going forward. suddenly this administration has said, you are misusing that fund, and you're like embezzling it, and you're giving it to Mexico. I mean, all these outrageous things that really irritated Bishop Hahn very much, and now they have to put some of their own resources toward a court fight. And I think that's also part of it. And that's a real, this president has done that in business maneuvers before. What does it take to make them run out of money? And the easiest route that he has found is let's drag them through the courts for as long as possible so they can't fight anymore. And he's going to do that to the churches.
That's right.
Terry, what was your reaction?
The same question that you asked in the last episode. Empathy is our problem. Right? That empathy is our weakness, and they're applying that to international affairs, when in fact it is partnership and is cooperation internationally that makes us strong. And so it sends a signal not only to people across the world, but it also sends signals within our own population that you better figure out how you're going to show your allegiance to this administration, to this president. You better show how you're going to contribute to his well-being by having a membership at Mar-a-Lago, or by contributing to his Trump coin, or the kind of public corruption that's taking place right now. It is a signal that benefits are going to come to those who agree and who capitulate and who go along with it, and harassment and legal claims and maybe even other kinds of enforcement actions are going to be taken against those who resist. And this is, I hope, could become, in this moment, a land of the free and the home of the brave kind of moment for all of us, to realize that we don't want to live this way.
Oh, and Jeff, could I add really quickly, in an indigenous worldview, and in many cultures across the world, we have a circular model of society that understands that no one is more important or has more authority or responsibility than another, or gets to acquire wealth and stuff and status to themselves. In my culture, the most respected leader is the one that actually has very little, because they've literally given it away to those who need it. And the response to, indigenous people basically saying, you guys, everybody else leave, is that some of the relationships that exist now and were forged over time are because of that recognizing that the circle of relationship is sacred, that all that is created is sacred and represents Creator's intent, and that we're supposed to cultivate one another. And to make war is the last possible thing you want to do. And in fact, capital punishment in my culture was if you actually took food from someone else.
Interesting.
And I just want to add that I think the Christian and Abrahamic traditions in general believe in one Creator, and therefore one humanity, just no matter what culture we're part of, and respect for the creation. And what that led to is a kind of notion of rule of law, because we want legal standards to be applied to everyone equally. But that is, in fact, what's being destroyed today. And so all of what we're talking about here really, for Christians, can go back to, do you believe that there is one Creator of all the families of the earth, or not? And that Creator loves and values and cherishes each of them, and
calls them good.
And calls them good, and in fact says that every in-group is to be a blessing to the other in-groups, not just competitors, or not trying to create some kind of pyramidal system.
And the LGBTQ people in my congregation need that assurance as much as the immigrants and anyone else right now as being targeted.
When we talk about going back in history, we see a great deal of momentum in some communities to require the posting of the 10 Commandments. And I'd like each of your take for those communities that are really focusing on expressing their Christian faith. Is that appropriate, given the fact that Jesus gave us some additional guidelines for behavior? What are your takes on that? Sister, I see you grinning. I'll start with you.
I want to say I often say, don't hypocritically post the 10 Commandments unless you understand underneath those, the very first one is love as God loves you. And that's a non-exclusive love. It is an inclusive invitation. So you're posting those, then live them. Otherwise, there is a hypocrisy in even intending to post them. The other thing that I always come back to is Jesus really gave us one commandment: love one another. Period. That's really the only command that he gave: love one another. And he said that to his, as was mentioned before, that he said that not only to the state, which cost him lots, but he also said that to his own church leadership. You bind heavy burdens, but you do nothing yourself. He said hypocrite, which was like a 4-letter word. And essentially, they didn't like that. So, I think Jesus got himself into trouble and was willing to take the risk and do what needed to be done. So I want to say, don't post the commandments. That makes a farce, not only of the commandments, but of yourself. It's hypocritical, and I want to say immoral, actually.
Yeah, I think we have a tradition in the country of the government not promoting one tradition or any tradition at all. Posting the 10 Commandments is really an attempt by, again, more authoritarian or white Christian nationalist leaders to tell individuals that you better watch out, you better toe the line, you better obey, or you're going to be in trouble. And that you'll be in trouble with the state and you'll be in trouble with God. But actually, the 10 Commandments don't just apply to individuals. They're a community set of standards. And one of them is, no other gods before me, which is to say that your highest loyalty should be to all of life and to the creator of all of life, and not to a nation or a party or a president or a king. And so by actually posting the 10 Commandments, they're actually breaking it. So these public values in the 10 Commandments, like honor the Sabbath, well, that means people aren't meant to be tools. They're not to be exploited. They're to be able to enjoy life. Things like don't misuse God's name. Well, what is that about? That's not about not cursing. That's about governments not claiming, as the Egyptian Pharaoh claimed, to be put there by God, and so therefore the government can't be questioned. So if we actually had a conversation about the 10 Commandments, they would see the 10 Commandments encourage them not to post them, but in fact call us to live a life which recognizes that there is one creator of all, and we're to create a society in which everyone is respected. That's the calling of the 10 Commandments, and I don't see them desiring to post it as exemplifying that at all.
And in the communal rabbinical literature that sort of reflects on this phenomenon, what I'm reading there is this understanding that, look, the Jewish tradition has never seen those as commandments. They were part of a long list of Mosaic and Levitical law. They're not really special or above that. There are summations of some of that. So it's really the Christian tradition, that sort of very specific version of Christian tradition, that has picked this up and said, we're going to use these now as a cudgel and beat people into a religious attitude that basically empowers the authoritarian complex. And that is, as you said, antithetical to what Jesus is doing in terms of bringing together a loving, diverse community that is not violent toward one another and does not use the law as a cudgel. Jesus was seen by the early Christians as completing the law and no longer being necessary to follow the previous law if one is living out of love.
Yeah. And I want to say, if you go back to the New Testament, or to at least what we know of Jesus, he never essentially specifically used the 10 Commandments. It was that one command: love those, just plain love.
In that wonderful moment, I love the early authors are sitting there saying, look, we saw this vision where Moses, Abraham or Moses was there and Isaiah's there and they're having this conversation, blah, blah. And actually then they disappear.
That's right.
They disappear. They disappear. Because what we're to focus on is how when Jesus comes down from the mountain, that is what we are supposed to do, is to be as Jesus.
And just one clarification, for the audience, love one another doesn't mean just love people within your own in-group, because Jesus is clear that you are also to love your enemy. and that is to work for their well-being, not just to have warm feelings for them. Until the day comes when all the mishpacha, all the nations, all the families, all the cultures, and the tribes sit down at a great feast at which God will heal all of the divisions. I think human beings need in-groups. And I think we tend to trust our own in-group more than we trust other groups, and even distrust them. But I believe the Abrahamic tradition, I believe all wisdom traditions around the world are calling us to recognize the humanity of every in-group, and to work for a time when we can love our own, when we can have our own tradition, and we can also learn from and respect and enjoy and partner with people of every other in-group tradition, tribe, clan, and culture in the world. And I believe that that's the vision of Jesus.
And I think the most challenging conversations to have is when people are basically telling me I should be okay with them oppressing me and with my rights going away. Yes. I should be okay with that. That's God's will. I'm like, no.
Not gonna fly.
No.
Not gonna fly. So
Someone said that to me right after the election. Well, this is God's will. I said, no, it isn't. It is not God's will. I'm sorry.
well, on that note, and it's my inner wish is that we could go on forever, but there is a clock out there that we have to respect, and I would hope that maybe we can gather again sometime and extend out this conversation that's been so rich. So thank you, each of you, for joining in with this and bringing your perspectives and wisdom.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you very much.
And thank you, each of you, for joining us on this edition of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll join us again next week.